Welcome, everybody. We have another discussion today about ultranationalism and genocide. Today, the context is in regards to the Holodomor, or the Ukrainian genocide. Holodomor literally translates to death by hunger. In this, we see the starvation of millions of Ukrainians from 1932 to 1933 as a result of Soviet policies. So, what was the Holodomor? See on the map, Ukraine is colored red here. Now we could change this map a little bit, being that southern peninsula sticking out. Crimea has been annexed by Russia, but anyway, the term Holodomor refers to the genocidal famine in Ukraine that occurred in 1932 to 1933, during which millions of men, women, and children were starved to death by the communist regimes of Joseph Stalin. So Holodomor means death inflicted by starvation. Here, food was used as a weapon against the Ukrainian rural population. It was also an attack and a campaign of intimidation and arrests of Ukrainian intellectuals, writers, artists, religious leaders, and political cadres. So, people who were seen as a threat to Soviet ideological and state building aspirations. So Soviet authorities, they sought to repress Ukrainian aspirations for autonomy and eradicate all opposition to collectivization and communist rule. We're going to look at a timeline here to understand the Holodomor. 1891, first Ukrainian settlers come to the Canadian West. We see quite a few Ukrainian immigrants arrive in Canada from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. 1900, Ukrainian lands and people are divided between the Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires. This is prior to World War I. Majority of Ukrainians lived under the Russian Empire. I myself had family that lived in the Austro-Hungarian section. It was called Galicia. In 1914, Canada enters World War I as part of the British Empire, the Triple Entente. And we see in Canada the policies of internment. Over 5,000 Ukrainians, so Galicians, Ruthenians, from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So in Canada, these people are seen as the enemy for a while. Ukrainians find themselves in the Russian army fighting against Ukrainians in the Austro-Hungarian army. 1915 to 1916, we have the Armenian genocide inside the Turkish Empire. 1917, this is March, Russian Revolution and the breakup of the Russian Empire. So if you remember from previous lectures, the Russian Revolution is what caused Russia to step out of the war. They signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, and here we now have the breakup of the Russian Empire. So Ukraine sets up a temporary government, the Central Rada, separate from Russia. 1917, the Bolshevik takeover in Petrograd, Russia. 1918, Ukraine declares independence as the Ukrainian National Republic. So for a few years in between 1918 and 1921, Ukraine was an independent country. They wanted to retain this independence before they eventually succumbed to the Red Army and were incorporated then into the Soviet Union, the USSR. So 1918 to 1920, they attempt to remain an independent state. But this is while they're fighting the Red Army, so the Bolsheviks or the Communists, also the White Army, the Russian monarchists, the Poles and the Romanians, all on Ukrainian soil. March 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk ends the war on the Eastern Front with Germany, so signed by the Central Rada of Ukraine as a separate country. Leon Trotsky for the Bolshevik government of Russia acknowledges Ukrainian territorial integrity as a separate country. So this sovereignty that the Ukraine has for a while. In 1919, they're left out, though, of these self-determination hearings at the Treaty of Versailles. So after the war at the Treaty of Versailles, Ukraine is not accepted as a separate country at these peace talks. So their sovereignty wasn't fully recognized. 1918 to 1921, we have civil war raging throughout the Russian Empire. This includes some of the territory of the Ukraine, as both the Red and White armies clash with each other and with Ukrainians. 1920, Bolsheviks gain control of Ukraine with the aid of the Red Army. Ukrainian politicians go into exile. 1921 to 1922, we see a famine raging in the Ukraine. 1.5 million Ukrainians starved to death in this first famine. One of the reasons that this famine is occurring is food is confiscated and taken out of Ukraine to feed Russian cities. A little bit about famine. Famines are preventable. The Ukraine is known as the breadbasket of Europe. What does that mean? They grow a lot of food. They grow a lot of wheat, similar to the prairies of Canada. Right? We produce all sorts of wheat. So there's food that is grown there. However, famine being used here as a government policy means that the food being grown is being used for other people. This is what we see later as well in the 1930s at the Holodomor. Famine, though, again, like I said, this is not inevitable. Famines can be stopped and prevented. There's been some interesting research, such as done by people like Amartya Sen, who they show that no democratic nation has ever had a famine. Sen argues, he compares between China and India in the 20th century. India, even though there were some low standards of living, because they had a democracy, they never experienced famines. Whereas in China, famines killed millions and millions of people because of man-made policies. Anyway, 1921, we have the NEP, the new economic policy. It's brought in by the Russian Bolsheviks to build the economy. What this does is it allows small farm holdings, permitting Ukrainian farmers to continue farming their private land lots and running small businesses in Soviet-controlled Ukraine. And then in 1922, the Ukraine is formally incorporated into the Soviet Union as a republic, with Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine as the new capital. So the Ukraine is no longer a sovereign nation. 1924, Vladimir Lenin dies as power struggle for control results between Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. 1925, we start seeing Ukrainization policy being brought in as part of the indigenization policy of the USSR. So what this did was it was to appease the nationalistic Ukrainian population and its demands and encourage Ukrainians to join the Russian Communist Party. So in the 20s, we see a cultural renaissance arising. Ukrainian artists, writers, film directors, they embrace this call and they continue to develop an indigenous Ukrainian culture. So it's encouraged and it flourishes in schools and government offices. And as a result of this, some Ukrainian intellectuals joined the Communist Party of Ukraine. 1928, Joseph Stalin takes complete control of the Soviet Union and the Communist Party, and he introduces the first 5-year plan. At the center of the 5-year plan are the goals of collectivization and industrialization. Stalin wanted to quickly industrialize the Soviet Union, and one of the ways they did this was through the attempt of collectivization. Essentially, the state would confiscate whatever you grew, bring it to a collective place, and from there, the theory is that it would be redistributed amongst the population. However, what we see is it ends up being shipped out to other places, such as other countries, to pay for things like industrial machines or weapons for the war effort, or to build up the army. So 1929, the Russians or the Soviets, they now launch an attack on Ukrainian national elites. So anyone like potential leaders of resistance, they would be targeted and arrested. So 700 members, and were arrested in a show trial of a fictitious Union for the Liberation of Ukraine organization. So people accused of wanting an independent Ukraine with links to farmers and the Orthodox Church. These are all destroyed. 1930, the Ukrainian autocephalous. So this is autonomous from the Moscow Patriarch. So the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is liquidated. Leaders are imprisoned or executed. So you start seeing an attack against that Ukrainian nationality here. 1929 to 1930, we see dekulakization. Over 1.5 million farmers and families in Ukraine are sent to Siberia, executed, or sent to concentration camps. So going along with those collectivization programs, property of rich farmers are confiscated and transferred to collective farms. Some of the stuff that starts happening then is uprisings against the government, half of which is occurring in the Ukraine. Now you can imagine that the Soviet Union did not like these uprisings against them. So in 1932, Stalin prepares for the genocidal famine. So he does this by setting unrealistic grain procurements for Ukraine. So 40% of the harvest in Ukraine is to be handed over to the government. Very little is left for farmers and their families. So farmers live off of their depleted reserves and small plots and farm animals. Some Ukrainian farmers flee to cities, to Russia and Belarus in search of food. August 7th, 1932, the Kolkhoz property decree is passed. This was the death penalty if you stole any grain in the field. Special teams were sent out. They would search homes. They would seize foodstuffs. Starving farmers would sometimes be killed if they were leaving the farms. There would even be things like guard towers or watch towers that had soldiers posted in them to prevent people from taking any of the harvest. While these crops that are being grown in the Ukraine are being sent abroad. If you were an unproductive village in the Ukraine and you were deprived of manufactured goods and foodstuffs, you'd be blacklisted. So villages are cordoned off by troops, people left to starve. 1932, Communist Party liquidates all non-government literary organizations in the Ukraine. 1933, we see the widespread starvation in Ukraine, the Kuban, and Caucasus. December 1932, there's a secret decree that blames Ukrainization, national tendencies, for grain problems. So because of this, Ukrainian language is now forbidden in the Russian Republic. So in Ukraine, the Ukrainian leadership is purged, gradually being replaced by non-Ukrainians. So this is a process of Russification. So basically anything showing Ukrainian culture or ethnicity was banned and banished. January 22nd, 1933. Secret directive is sent to Kharkiv to close the border of Ukraine and Kuban from the rest of the USSR. This is to prevent starving farmers from searching for food. In 6 weeks, 220,000 are arrested. Many shot or sent to the Gulag. 85% sent home to starve. Red Cross demanded permission to send famine relief. Well, Moscow just denied that there was any famine going on at all, and so they rejected this relief. Remember, this is a man-made famine. Therefore, if Russia or the USSR were to admit that there was a famine, that would be admitting their part in it. At the peak of the famine, June to July 1933, 28 100,000 Ukrainians die per day. 1933, Hitler comes to power in Germany, and the United States recognizes the USSR as a legitimate government. So while the famine is occurring, the USSR is getting legitimized by Western powers and the rest of the world. In fact, in 1934, ignoring the genocide that occurred in the Ukraine, the League of Nations opens their arms to the USSR and invites them to be a part of it. Here's some images showing starvation that was occurring. And I threw in one newspaper article to again show that there was knowledge of this. It's not that this was occurring in a closed bordered land where nobody knew of it. This was being reported on. This is familiar with all the genocides we're going to talk about. And so between 1932 and 1934, approximately 4 million deaths are attributed to starvation within the borders of the Soviet Ukraine. This is not including deportations, executions, or deaths from ordinary causes. But what happens is Stalin denies to the world that there's any famine in Ukraine and continues to export millions of grains, more than enough to have saved every starving man, woman, and child. Denial, our last stage of genocide, something that's occurring to this day. Soviet Union adamantly refused any outside assistance because, again, they were a regime denying that there was any famine. If you claimed contrary, you were accused of spreading anti-Soviet propaganda. So Western governments adopted a passive attitude towards the famine, although most of them had become aware of the true suffering in Ukraine through confidential diplomatic channels. November 1933, U.S., under the newly elected president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, they recognized Stalin's communist government and negotiate sweeping new trade agreements. So while this is going on, U.S. opens up trade with them. However, the pattern of denial continues the following year with the admission of the Soviet Union into the League of Nations. Those nations were unwilling to disrupt lucrative trade agreements. Famine was less important. This map shows countries that do recognize the Holodomor. It's a shocking map when you look at it. How many countries are in the red? So the dark red, they recognize Holodomor as a genocide. And then the lighter red, it recognizes it as a criminal act of the Stalinist regime. It's not a lot of countries in the world. Russia to this day does not recognize the Holodomor. On to the late 1980s, with a published book and an eye-opening documentary, did the greater world's attention come to the Holodomor. Soviet Ukraine, of course, it was kept out of official media until late 1980s, shortly before Ukraine won its independence in 1991. With the fall of the Soviet Union, previously inaccessible archives, as well as testimony of survivors that was once suppressed, has yielded massive evidence offering proof of Ukraine's tragic famine genocide of the 1930s. So November 28, 2006, the Parliament of Ukraine, they passed a decree defining Holodomor as a deliberate act of genocide. Russia to this day continues to call it a one-sided falsification of history. So to this day, that stage of genocide denial is still being practiced. The image here shows you the very first Holodomor memorial was actually in Edmonton. This was made in 1983. So this is just outside of Edmonton City Hall. Still there. So in the first large-scale academic study of the famine, there was an estimated 5 million deaths. That's our last case study we are going to look at for genocides. This one we did a little bit differently, looking at a timeline instead of the stages. But what you see here is just like in the other ones, you have organization, preparation, symbolism, dehumanization, an attack against the nationalistic elements in Ukraine, and then denial, which is still going on.